We've made it to election day, and while there's excitement all around, we know that it's just the beginning of an election period that will take longer than, what we're used to in order to get results. Those who insist otherwise are part of a desperate disinformation campaign, which can be seen all over right-wing media because, well, they know they're losing and they're working any angle to cheat their way in. It's important that we all know how to stop disinformation from Trump allies and outside influencers like Russia. Today on the program, disinformation expert Nina Jankowicz joins me to discuss. Ms. Jankowicz is the Disinformation Fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., where she studies the intersection of democracy and technology in Central and Eastern Europe. She's the author of How to Lose the Information War, Russia, Fake News, and the Future of Conflict. Thanks for joining us, Nina. I really appreciate it today.
Thanks for having me.
How are you experiencing the beginning of this election day, and what will you be looking for as this day plays out?
I'm actually pretty optimistic heading into this election day. I think we've seen a lot of hard work from the dedicated few civil servants in the federal government who have been addressing these issues over the past couple of years, despite really intransigence and dereliction of duty from parts of the Trump administration. And I've also been really encouraged speaking with some of the state secretaries of state who are administering elections, both Republican and Democrat, I do have to say, across the country, who are doing everything they can to make sure that this election is safe and secure. The attempts at interference that we've seen so far from Russia, from Iran, from China don't seem to have had any effect. And we've just heard another announcement from the director of the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, Chris Krebs, about that this morning. I do trust Mr. Krebs a lot. I think he's a really stand-up official. And frankly, I think the high turnout that we've seen so far shows adversaries like Russia, like China, and even the domestic disinformers in our own country that we're not going to stand for this type of disinformation that denigrates the democratic process. So I think Americans are doing exactly what they should be doing. And hopefully, if things are tied up a little bit sooner than we expect, there won't be as much chance for those vulnerabilities you mentioned at the beginning of the segment.
Let's talk specifically about disinformation. Can you give us a definition of what disinformation is in this time of fake news? It certainly seems like there's a lot. And how can we identify it when we see it?
Sure. So disinformation is the use of false or misleading information with malign intent. So obviously that's what our adversaries abroad do, but we have some folks at home who are using disinformation as well. When your aunt or uncle... Yes, like Trump. I do have to say, though, there's also folks on the very far left of the spectrum who have been sharing disinformation and engaging in harassment and trolling campaigns. And we know that people all across the spectrum are frankly vulnerable to disinformation. And those sorts of polarizations and fissures in our society are exactly what adversaries, both foreign and domestic, who are using disinformation try to exploit. You mentioned fake news. We have this preconception that this is about fakes, fake images, fake articles. Actually, the best disinformation is stuff that is grounded in a kernel of truth. It's why we've seen so much disinformation around the coronavirus pandemic, for instance, because there is this uncertainty and fear that all of us are feeling. We are highly exploitable. And there's similar feelings around this election as well. So I prefer to use that term disinformation rather than fake news, because it's a little bit misleading. It's not always about fakes. You can't always debunk straight up disinformation.
So you spoke a moment ago about the multiple actors, both internal and external, spreading disinformation about this election. Can you talk about I don't want to give focus to the kind of disinformation exactly that we're seeing, but what is the end game of these different groups?
Well, I think on the foreign side of things,
who are spreading the disinformation.
Yeah, on the foreign side of things with Russia, we see, the desire for chaos, the desire to amplify distrust in the democratic system. And frankly, with the domestic disinformation we've been seeing, we're making that job easy for adversaries like Russia. All they have to do is frankly hit retweet on one of the president's tweets or share something he's posted on Facebook or any of the folks in his, inner circle, and their job is done. They don't need that creativity and brute force that we saw in 2016. For actors countries like China and Iran, things are a little bit different. China is more in the propaganda sphere. It wants to put forth a positive image of the Chinese Communist Party. It wants to put forth a positive image of how they've handled the coronavirus pandemic, and it has that political bent to it. And then Iran is a little bit newer in the disinformation game, at least in the foreign sphere. And we saw them just last week or 2 weeks ago use those spoofed Proud Boys emails to intimidate Democratic voters from showing up and voting. Luckily, the folks I mentioned before at the Department of Homeland Security caught that and outed that operation very quickly. And that's what we need more of, rather than this intelligence politicization we've seen under the Trump administration. We need our intelligence officials telegraphing those threats to the American people very, very clearly. And then on the domestic side, most of the disinformation that we've seen, this highly emotionally manipulative content, is coming from the right. If you look at the top 10, most engaged with posts on Facebook or Twitter on a given day, they are usually posts that are coming from the right. And that's because the right does deal in this highly emotional rhetoric. But everybody should make sure whether, no matter who you're voting for, if you feel yourself reacting very emotionally to a piece of content, it's a good indication that that content is manipulative in some form. So I encourage everybody to practice informational distancing. Just put some distance between yourself and your device, walk away, think about it a little bit. And if it's still wondering, if it's nagging at you, then you can do a little lateral reading, see if anyone else is reporting that, learn how to do a reverse image search so that you can see if an image has been either manipulated or misattributed, which we're seeing a lot lately. And I would say most importantly, especially as, we work to certify the election results, go to the source for information. Don't listen to politicians and pundits. Go to your local and state election officials. They're the people who are getting coffee next to you at the coffee shop in the morning. You might go to church, or your kids might play on the same soccer team. They're there to protect your vote. They are working very hard to do that in really unprecedented conditions. And frankly, they're more trusted than our federal officials. So go to those folks, see what they're reporting, look at your local and state election board websites and Twitter. And don't be fooled by, website defacements and things like that. That might happen in the coming days from our adversaries. Those websites, media websites, state and election board websites, they're not connected on the back end to our voting infrastructure. So just take that with a grain of salt, slow down, and be calm, because this is what democracy is all about. And sometimes it's a little bit messy, but, I think our process is showing itself to be resilient, as are the American people.
So wonderful. That's a great idea, because when you read something about emotional distancing from what you're reading, when you read a science paper, it never upsets you so much.
That's true.
Oh, they found that magnesium in the water can cause, no one gets super upset about that. Can you talk about what makes people vulnerable to disinformation? I know you mentioned the fact that there's usually a grain of truth to it.
Yeah, so a lot of it is based in this emotional reaction, or the emotional lens through which we see the world. We're seeing a rise in conspiracy theories and their popularity over the last couple of months, because people are looking for a way to explain, sometimes in simple terms, sometimes in not so simple terms, but perhaps more understandable than what we're going through right now, everything that's happening in their lives, whether that is, the political situation, the pandemic, how they intersect, all of that stuff. And then, we also see some differences in media literacy and age having an effect on how people interpret information. So older folks are a little bit worse at interpreting and contextualizing information online. And that's because, frankly, they have grown up and been adults in an environment where the media were trusted sources and were doing essentially content moderation and curation for a very long time. So when you see something on your Facebook feed or on Twitter or whatever social media platform you use, older folks tend to not contextualize that, tend to trust the source that they see it coming from, and not necessarily do any of that lateral reading.
Wow, you just explained my whole family. Thank you. I appreciate that. Like, why? How is it that you can think this? It's insane. And then there you have it.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I'm always advocating for is that, we teach across the board, not just kids in schools, but older folks, voting age adults, about media and digital literacy, about cyber hygiene, because they can be victims of all sorts of attacks, again, foreign and domestic. Recently, this fall, we had an indictment come down about Russian interference that explained how some of the trolls in the troll factory in St. Petersburg were using Bitcoin scams and stealing people's identities in order to make money on the side in addition to their troll factory job. So there's a lot of facets to this, and we need to make sure that people understand all the tools and tactics, but also understand how to approach their information diet. It should be a diet. It shouldn't just be, consuming and gorging yourself on one source all the time. It's kind of like a buffet, right? And comparing, contrasting different ways of reporting, comparing and contrasting the context, all really important for people across the spectrum. And if you look at other countries that are more resilient, most of my research focuses on Central and Eastern Europe. They often have really robust news environments that aren't as polarized as ours, or they have a state-run media outlet like the BBC, for instance, in Britain, which almost 60% of British citizens trust in a time of crisis. I can't think of a single outlet that would hold the same statistic for Americans. So that's something really important to consider as well. Investment in journalism as a public good, but also teaching people the tools they need to navigate this unprecedented flow of information.
You said in your recent piece, is Russian meddling as dangerous as we think, that unless we mitigate our own political polarization and our own internal issues, we will continue to be an easy target for any malign actor. Can you talk a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my research in Central and Eastern Europe, which brings me to how I interpret the events in the United States today, it's clear that actors like Russia are using those internal fissures, things like our systemic racism here in the United States, things like economic inequality, to amplify these issues and really make us distrust the system and want to disengage in it. Now, I hope we're issuing a strong rebuke of that, as I mentioned at the top, by turning out in droves for this election. But we also need good governance in order to solve these issues. And this politicization that we've seen over the past 4 years, even for things that shouldn't be partisan issues at all, like media literacy campaigns or something like that, that has really left us even more vulnerable for manipulation. So until we do the hard work of solving those big issues, we're going to continue to be vulnerable. And the countries that have faced, Russian disinformation for many decades, like Estonia, for instance, where they had a large ethnic rift between ethnic Russians and ethnic Estonians after the fall of the Soviet Union, they realized that they couldn't just, force all of those ethnic Russians to speak Estonian and culturally assimilate to Estonia. They had to really work on integration in society. And what caused them to realize that was a Russian information warfare attack in 2007. So all this stuff is extraordinarily important. And right now we look at this as a game of whack-a-troll. We're saying, oh, we can just take these accounts offline. We can put up our cyber walls and make sure our infrastructure is protected. That's true. But, Russia could decide tomorrow to stop engaging in this stuff, and we're still vulnerable to that manipulation from other foreign actors and domestic actors as well. It's just ripe for amplification.
We are asking people in our purview to do their civic duty, investigate content before sharing it in order to protect 2020. How much can we put on the American public that uses the internet to help stop the spread of disinformation? How useful can this be?
Yeah, obviously, there is a role for government, which has mostly been left, as I said, abdicated by this administration. There's also a role for the media, which I think has grown more circumspect. The social media platforms are starting to do more. I would still argue it's not enough, and their whole conception of how they address disinformation is a bit skewed. But we do have to understand that the most successful disinformation is often stuff that's spread organically. We put a lot of focus on Russian ads in 2016, but even then, the most successful pieces of that content were the ones that Americans shared willingly themselves without being advertised to. So I think we all need to understand a little bit that the most engaging content on social media is the most enraging content, back to that emotional manipulation before. And frankly, we should all just slow our roll, slow the spread of disinformation, think before you share. And that's an important way to engage in general. I would say approach it as if you are speaking to someone in person and it's not just you interacting with a screen, right? Would you say that thing to somebody that you didn't know? Would you broadcast it for all of the world to see if you hadn't verified that information before? We need to just really introduce some friction into that environment. And no, it's not all on the shoulders of the American people, but we do need to realize the role that we play in spreading this stuff.
In the coming days, what should people be on the lookout for in terms of disinformation that you believe is coming at us from these actors, whether they be foreign or domestic?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of attempts to undermine the credibility of the voting process. And we've seen that already, the groundwork for that campaign being laid on the Republican side for months. I think foreign actors are definitely amplifying that sort of stuff. We've seen in overt Russian propaganda, they're echoing those messages. So just as you said at the top of the show, as we understand that this is going to be a longer process than it might normally be, that doesn't mean that the process is going wrong. That's just how it's going to work this year. And we need to have confidence that it will sort itself out. That doesn't mean necessarily that, the legitimacy of the election has been undermined. That's number one. Number two, we might see, as I mentioned before, some defacements of either local or state election websites or media websites. Those defacements don't cast any doubt on the legitimacy of the process. That's almost as if, Russia or another actor, foreign or domestic, again, is rattling the cyber door saying, hi, we're here, but they haven't necessarily opened that door yet. So don't let that freak you out. The third thing is that we might see some hack and leak operations in the coming weeks that, again, are either going to attempt to undermine the legitimacy of the process or of the candidates or potential winner. And when or if we see those, I think it's really important to understand the context. Who hacked the documents, who leaked the documents, and what is their goal in all of this, rather than just reporting on the contents, as we saw in 2016 with the hack and leaks from Russia that affected the DNC and the Clinton campaign. We really need that context. And I think we've shown that we're capable of doing that with this whole Hunter Biden laptop saga, which we've been more circumspect about in reporting.
Nina Jankowicz, Disinformation Fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us and helping us preemptively and prophylactically get through the next, hopefully it's just a couple of days, could be months. It's hard to know. But thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
If you're watching us on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share us with your friends. I think this is important information that people need to know about.